I'm very pleased to be the first and not the last speaker because I think we are coming to a stage where your collective patience will be tested to the limit. I'd like to thank the Army for this invitation. Uh, this particular occasion gives me great pleasure. I have had the opportunity to visit Sri Lanka many times before, but this is the first time I am visiting Sri Lanka after 2009 to discuss troubles that are other than Sri Lanka's own. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and of course, the hospitality and the kindness that you have shown us has been enormous. Uh, Much that I have to say has already been discussed. A background has already been given of the nature of conflicts that we are confronting. I will therefore essentially highlight certain aspects that perhaps remain, particularly those that refer to or relate to the nature of state responses to terrorism. Uh, First of all, when we speak of terrorism, and this issue has been raised in the morning about definitional issues, I think we all know what terrorism is. I think we could also fairly easily define it if we could sit together and, in good faith, attempt to do so. Like all human conduct, all complex human conduct, terrorism will never yield a definition which would have no possible exceptions. But were it not for particular interests of state, particular states who have a particular investment in not evolving a consensual definition, I think we would have come to a definition by now. There was something about this, I think the chair in one of the earlier sessions had said, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I think this is based on a very, very poor understanding of the English language. Uh, Terrorism is a method, freedom fighting is an objective. A man can be both. He can be fighting for freedom, not on a moral plane, because if I am fighting for freedom at a moral level, I cannot terminate another man's freedom without just cause. Uh, but a lot of people who believe they are fighting for the freedom of their own subgroup could engage in terrorist violence. Terrorism is a method that specifically and intentionally targets civilians. Another definitional issue that I'd like to get into, because it's going to reflect on much of what we've been talking about terrorism since the morning. But what one doesn't understand is that we are no longer talking about the terrorism of the 60s or the 70s. We are now talking about well, somebody used the expression hybrid war. We are talking about elements of insurgency, civil war, and terrorism coming together. Most groups today are only insurgent or terrorist in terms of degree, not of type. All insurgent groups employ to some extent or the other, all current insurgent groups employ to some degree or the other the method of terrorism. All terrorist groups do have some insurgent base today. So we are now talking about this kind of war. You have had very, very, I think, authoritative descriptions given to you of the circumstances of disorder that are prevailing across the world, the readjustment of the world order, if you please, the breakdown of old equations of power. Uh, the principal thrust, I think, of these arguments is that we are in this for the long haul. Whatever our intentions, whatever we may do in the short run, and we will do much that is wrong, as has been the evidence of recent history, we will do much that is wrong. This is going to stay with us. There is a certain problem of perceptions over here. A few years ago, after 9/11, it was all about Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda was going to take over the world, and look, they wanted nuclear weapons, and look, they wanted chemical weapons, and they had this ideology of global conflict. Now it's the ISIS. Neither Al-Qaeda nor ISIS are permanent entities. In fact, I would like to suggest that all these groups are in essence on the wrong side of history. They will be defeated, they will be destroyed. The question is, how much damage will they do in the interim? And how much damage they will do in the interim will be defined by the nature of state responses. And I regret to say that overwhelmingly, state responses have failed to learn from the experiences of the past. Counterterrorism and counterinsurgency campaigns across the world have not been fought in accordance to any principles of counterterrorism or counterinsurgency. To take a very, very obvious example, let's take the American intervention or the ISAF intervention in Afghanistan. And now the Americans have a certain doctrine of counterinsurgency. They have a document that defines their counterinsurgency doctrine. And it says there must be at least 1 is to 20 force to population ratio for a counterinsurgency fight. This was never, ever met. Completely, and this was never met in Afghanistan, it was certainly not met in Iraq either. So we are not even fighting these wars in accordance with the principles we recognize as the essential or inherent principles of counterinsurgency warfare. And we are doing this essentially because considerations other than tactical and strategic dominate the contemporary world. And this is again something we will have to learn to deal with, particularly as far as democratic societies are concerned. The wars are fought not in accordance with strategy, but in accordance with the imperatives of the electoral cycle. Now, this is the first and most crucial contradiction of strategy. Wars have their own time frames. You cannot fight a protracted war on strategies and policies that have a 2-year or 3-year horizon, or less, very often, depending on your electoral cycles, and depending on the security or the popularity or the mandate of the governments. So we have a situation, and this is not just true of the particular example I'm given, but virtually of every country. I mean, I do recall till the early 2000s, Sri Lanka was in disarray. There was almost no flow of intelligence from the LTTE-held areas into the government side. But they learned slowly, gradually. They persevered because they did not have the option of a drawdown. They did not have the option of abandoning their country, so they had to fight it through. And that is what has usually happened in most theaters where terrorism or insurgent movements have been resolved, that over an extended period of time, after the first impact of shock, of confusion that invariably afflicts the state and its agencies, the state slowly begins to do what is necessary, and this is what we need to understand. Counterinsurgency is about capacities and capabilities. It is about building up the necessary. That's the essence of all strategy. What is the core of any strategy? First, a reality-based assessment of the threat. Second, a reality-based assessment of what the resources required to meet that threat or neutralize that threat. And the third is the deployment of these resources within a coherent framework. Now, I would like to suggest that the very first condition is almost never met. You have a completely delusional discourse. I mean, you have, in the West, you have ideas like somebody mentioned, I think this morning, the end of history. I recall when the Americans went into Afghanistan, many historians came creeping out of the woodwork, telling us that Afghanistan is a graveyard of foreign armies. This is historical nonsense. Afghanistan has been repeatedly occupied and defeated. The myth on which this idea is pinned, or rather the historical fact on which this myth is pinned, is one British campaign in which almost the entire force of the British, backed by the Indian troops and camp followers, was wiped out. There were 42 odd survivors out of a total fighting force of 4,500 people who were sent into, soldiers who were sent into Afghanistan. Thereafter, in the second Afghan war, the British prevailed. They got all that they wanted. They secured the objectives that they sought and pulled out. The third Afghan war, the Afghans initiated, trying to throw off the unfair terms of the British agreement, but were very conclusively defeated once again and imposed their conditions once again. So the idea that this myth making, which is constant and comes from many, many directions. Root causes. You cannot defeat insurgency by force of arms. You have to address the root causes. But how do you address the root causes in a situation where you have no command or control? In territories, actually the emergence of an insurgency means that the classical interventions of politics, of governance, of development have already failed. They have collapsed. To say that we must have development and good governance is to tell a man with cancer that he should go home and try to be healthy. The cure for cancer is not good health. The cure for an insurgency is not good government. That ship has already sailed. It is no longer an option. Consequently, you need to get down to the fundamentals. First, to restore control. And thereafter, of course, other factors will all come in. Factors such as good governance, development, delivery of public goods, all these. Another myth that has often frozen states, the idea that the contemporary pattern of terrorism cannot be deterred. I speak of Islamist terrorism, I speak of millenarian terrorism, I speak particularly of the IS brand of apocalyptic terrorism. How do you deter a group that seeks the end of the world? Not only that is willing to die on its individuals who are willing to die, but a group that consciously and ideologically seeks the end of the world. And this paralyzes us. But it paralyzes us again because we operate on stereotypes, we operate on broad perceptions. There is no unity of this entity called ISIS, as there was in fact no unity of the entity called Al-Qaeda, as indeed there has never been any great unity of any of these movements, other than the unity that we oppose on them, that we impose on them, by our consolidated opposition to everything that is branded as being related to them. Eventually, and I go back to the Sri Lankan case, they said that Prabhakaran was supposed to be, invulnerable, immortal. The entire top leadership was so well protected as far as the LTTE is concerned that nobody had any flow of intelligence on them. But that intelligence was slowly built up. Eventually, the intelligence building operations yielded Colonel Karna, who broke away from the LTTE and chose to cooperate with the government, opening new floodgates of intelligence. If you look at the ISIS today, I will take an example very quickly. If you look at the ISIS today, it is really a conglomeration of all forces in these countries, of a multiplicity of forces in these countries, including Ba'athists, who are really ideologically irreconcilable, but who have held some of the highest positions in ISIS. The point basically is to get to these individuals separately, or these subgroups separately, for which you require enormous intelligence capability. And that is the biggest problem when armies or when new terrorist movements emerge and the state tries to engage with them or encounter them or fight them. The essence of these movements, insurgent and terrorism, is deception, is stealth, is evasion. And therefore, the most significant instrumentality to be used against them is intelligence. And the intelligence must be such that it targets the most effective instrumentality against in any successful counterinsurgency has been the targeting of the leadership. As long as you are doing body counts, as long as you are looking for every body you can brand as a terrorist and say, this individual is the problem, you will not succeed. It is only when you have clear lists, of the leadership, of the people who are the essence of the problem, And then you begin the process of isolation and neutralization. Neutralization by one means or the other, securing their surrenders, their arrests, their conversion, their defection from the movement, or their death. It is at that juncture when the rate of attrition of leadership begins to exceed the rate of replacement of leadership. That is when insurgencies die. And they do not die in any other circumstances. This is the fact of the history of all insurgencies, most of which, once they have reached a certain level, will not terminate in less than 10 to 15 years. And that is the cycle that we should be looking at. That is the cycle we should be planning for. We are, in other words, engaged in what I would describe as a protracted attritional global struggle. Uh, the problem of our responses has also been enormously the collusion of states, or collusion or support in certain cases, explicit or implicit, or opportunistic. Almost every movement that you can speak of that is currently ravaging the world has had a history of some measure of state support at some stage. And this is not just the states we would like to paint as villains. This is not just the Islamist extremist states. It is also states. I mean, to take a very simple example, we were being given an example of Putin's opportunism this morning. But what about Bush's opportunism when he uses 9/11 to invade Iraq, which we apologize for and feel a little sorry about, but that's not really terrible villainy. It's a minor error of judgment, a little foible by a Western leader. It is not a little foible by a Western leader. It is, in fact, the basis of almost the entire destabilization of the Middle East today, with one provision, qualification, that I believe the Middle East was purely on political and demographic bases, analysis, bound to be destabilized at this phase, at this stage. That destabilization would not have been quite as rapid as it has been now and as uncontrolled as it has been now as a result of the Bush intervention and thereafter the continuing interventions, often misguided, to destabilize the Assad regime in Syria, and the premature withdrawal and then return to Iraq. Basically, we're talking about incoherence of policy over here, and we are talking about a long experience of insurgency where non-state actors backed by states have invariably up in a backlash which has affected or damaged their very supporters and sponsors. And yet we never learn. Yet in almost every army, everywhere, in every policy establishment today, you will find many people who say, no, but this works. It works tactically, it works for a little while. But broadly, it produces more and more chaos. It undermines the legitimacy of the state, and we had spoken this morning, several speakers had spoken of the essence and the importance of the legitimacy of the state. Essentially, I would like to, one point I'd like to make before I come to my concluding remarks is that terrorism and the kind of patterns of insurgency we are confronted with places before us appalling moral choices, really terrifying moral choices. I mean, take the Beslan school attack or the theater attack in Moscow, where hundreds were killed, thousands of lives, more than 1,000, 1,200 lives were at risk at a particular point of time. You need a special mindset, the training of human beings to be able to take rational decisions under these circumstances. And none of the options in these circumstances will ever be desirable. There will always be choices between one bad option and another. And I don't think we are really preparing, certainly not our policymakers, and possibly not even our counterinsurgency forces, to deal with this. We are also set, I think, to be looking at an escalation over here towards the adoption of weapons of mass destruction or the introduction of the WMDs into the terrorist arsenal at some stage or the other. I do not believe that any country in the world is actually prepared for this. In conclusion, I'd like to say what do we really need to be doing? One, we need to revise our time frames of conflict. These are protracted conflicts. We should be planning and preparing for decades, in which case we may be able to resolve these problems in years. But if we keep preparing for the months and the years, we will be fighting this for many decades to come. The essence is capacity creation, capacity within which I most overwhelmingly emphasize intelligence capabilities. We must also talk about building a global consensus against terrorism. This has been spoken of. There must be no exceptions to this rule. A message must go out that if you attach your cause to a terrorist act, your cause will be delegitimized. No cause can justify the murder of innocents. If you are fighting for justice, you cannot destroy other people's lives with this wanton disregard for the right of other people to live. And unless this message is accepted, unless all states say, yes, this will not be done, I'm afraid Mr. Karzai made the statement this morning. He says, we will never be able to end terrorism as long as some of us think it is useful. And as long as some of us continue to think it is useful, we will never be able to do so. We must develop capacities. I do not believe these capacities are going to come in from international organizations. Individual states or coalitions of states will have to do this to inflict penalties on state sponsors of terrorism. It was mentioned this morning that almost all terrorist movements, I have also reiterated, almost all terrorist movements have some state backing, some safe haven, some resource transfer from established states. These states must have to pay. The strategies I speak of when I say imposition of penalties do not necessarily include, but do not necessarily exclude, military force. There are a multiplicity of other instrumentalities that can be used. And finally, I think we must, in order to delegitimize this instrumentality of terrorism, we must inflict demonstrable defeats on the terrorists. Edmund Burke once said, these are, speaking of in a different context, of course, that these are armed ideologies. They must be defeated before they can be discredited. You cannot engage in an ideological debate with individuals who think a bullet in your brains is the best argument. These ideologies will have to be defeated before they can be discredited. Thank you so much.